Quando pensamos na missão de Deus, precisamos compreender que não se trata apenas de conhecimento teológico, mas também exige de nós uma compreensão cultural. Na primeira parte da minha conversa com Christopher Wright, nós falamos a respeito de fundamentos teológicos e como Deus revela sua missão na história. Mas hoje você verá um conteúdo a respeito da nossa cultura, a respeito dos ídolos que nos cercam e como nós podemos lidar com todas essas coisas. E nada melhor do que conversar com alguém que de fato entende do assunto. Eu tive uma conversa com Christopher Wright, um clérigo anglicano, missiólogo e também estudioso do Antigo Testamento. Ele é atualmente diretor de ministérios internacionais da Lavan Partnership International, substituindo seu grande amigo John Stott. Ele era diretor da All Nations Christian College e hoje é membro honorário da All Souls Church, em Londres, Reino Unido. Além do mais, Wright escreveu inúmeros livros sobre missão, sendo que muitos deles estão traduzidos em português. Inclusive, hoje eu vou falar um pouco sobre o seu livro mais recente a respeito dos ídolos da nossa cultura. O link dos livros estará aqui na descrição do vídeo. Por isso, para mim, hoje é um grande privilégio poder conversar com uma pessoa que eu admiro tanto e que influenciou muito a minha forma de pensar e fundamentar a teologia bíblica e também a teologia missional. Antes de começarmos a nossa conversa a respeito do seu livro mais recente, precisamos compreender que Christopher Wright foi alguém que viveu e vive em um dos contextos onde o evangelho tem sido mais desprezado. Um contexto que vem de uma pós-cristandade com reflexos de um mundo pós-cristão. Muitos acreditam que esse contexto vai se tornar muito comum nos próximos anos nos países ocidentais. Por isso, como uma sociedade se torna pós-cristã? Como atuar com a missão de Deus em um contexto pós-cristão? Essa foi a minha pergunta aí.
Another big question, and you really need a sort of historical missiologist to answer that, someone like Andrew Walls or so on. Europe, of course, has become post-Christian more in the sense of being post-Christendom. That is, that we have moved past the centuries when you had whole nations that were, quote, Christian because it was illegal to be anything else. And the power of the state was allied to the power of the church. And so you get this nexus between political power and religious power, which in many ways was very damaging, I think, to the nature of what Christian faith should be all about. And we've moved past that era, certainly in Europe. Interestingly, in the United States, you have a nation that was founded on rejecting that connection between the church and the state. And yet, curiously, among many Christians in America, there is still a kind of Christendom mentality. That is the desire that if only we can get Christians, as it were, to be at the top in power, then somehow all our problems will be solved and we can have a better society. And that in itself is somewhat questionable, because often we know that when Christians get into power, they often can easily become just as corrupt and corruptible as any other fallen human being, because we're all sinners. And so we shouldn't imagine that somehow the answer to a post-Christian society is to get Christians back into political power, because it's not very likely to solve the problem. I think what we have to do probably is to realize that a post-Christian society is in itself a mission field. It is a bit like going back to the Roman Empire, you know, when Christians had to bear witness to the lordship of Christ in a culture and society who didn't know what on earth they were talking about. You know, you talk about this Jesus as Lord, well, who on earth is Jesus? You know, you haven't even heard of him. Oh, he got crucified. Well, what sort of leader is that then? You know, so the message of the gospel has to be heard afresh. And the only way it can be heard afresh, I think, is when it is backed up by lives and communities that make it plausible. As Leslie Newbegin, for example, said, that the only real hermeneutic of the gospel, the only thing that makes the gospel understandable and believable, is when it's embodied in a community that believe it and live it. So it's when Christians live the gospel that the world will ask questions and eventually come to see the truth. That's how the Roman Empire was changed, because the pagans began to see something different about Christians. So witness in a post-Christian society, which you're right, is what Europe is becoming, is already, and probably may well be what happens in other European type civilizations like North America and Australia and elsewhere. If that happens, then we've got another missional challenge, and we have to think it through, but we have to still be faithful to the centrality of the gospel.
Em seu livro mais recente, Christopher Wright vai mostrar que nós temos ídolos em todos os lugares. Mas como esse canal trata-se de missão e comunidade, a minha pergunta é em relação a isso. Como os ídolos da nossa cultura moldam a nossa forma de fazer a missão hoje? E como ídolos de nossa cultura estão infiltrados em nossas igrejas? Veja o que ele respondeu a respeito disso.
Well, yes, this book, it begins with a survey of the Old Testament concept of idolatry and gods and what they were in biblical times. But what I try to show is that the reasons why people desert the living God and choose gods for themselves is as old as the Garden of Eden. I mean, it goes right back to our human rebellion against God, in which we reject God's authority and effectively put ourselves in that place. The idolatry of the self, I think, is at the root of all other gods and idols, because we want to be in control of our own lives, whether it's as autonomous individuals, or we want to be in control of our nation's life. So we build all the idols of military security and guns and weapons, or we want simply the idolatry of power over other people. So we idolize great wealth or great political power and so on. And these are idols and gods which certainly can infect mission, because if we have sort of got to the position where we have put all our trust in management, that is, where there's a problem, we can manage it. Just get more money, get more solutions, be more technical, then mission can easily become like that. We go out, we see the world out there, here are all these people who don't know Jesus, let's manage the mission in the fastest way, the shortest possible time, and get it done, get the job done. We can end up with a kind of almost technocratic view of mission, that we have to just somehow apply all our skills and all our resources and all our cleverness, and God is sitting up there in heaven filled with admiration at how we are getting on with the mission, and we'll get it finished and then he can come back. Now, that's caricaturing it, of course, a bit, but some of the way people talk about mission can sound a bit like that. We'll get the job done, it's all up to us. That there's an element of arrogance and an element of idolatry in that. And of course, it is interesting in the Old Testament that most of the condemnation of the worship of other gods is addressed to Israel, the people who are supposed to know the living God. Of course, the other gods, the gods of the other nations, they worship their own gods. Well, yeah, of course they do, in a sense. They don't know any better yet, is the impression. Even Jeremiah says they've got all these gods and they're not really gods at all, but they stick with them. They're faithful to the gods that don't exist. And yet you, the people of Israel who know the living God, you have swapped him for false gods that break their promises, that can't be trusted, that leave you frustrated and disappointed. And that, of course, is gods like Baal, the god of fertility and wealth and sex and business. And so they were putting their faith in things that were not God. And that was the people of God, that was Israel. And that's why I would say that in our contemporary culture, whether it's in North America or in Brazil and South America, there is a great danger that the church, who are the people who are supposed to know who the living God is, end up doing what Deuteronomy calls just worshiping the gods of the people around you. That is, that we simply go with the culture, we go with the flow. So if the culture surrounds us, worships wealth and power and dazzling, spectacular celebrity, then so does the church. And so we also get into a kind of celebrity cult or a wealth cult, because that's what the society does. And people get seduced by those things, which are fundamentally idolatrous. So when idolatry gets into the church, which it does, then I think it's even more frustrating, could I put it like that, to God himself, because we are supposed to be the people who know the living God and reject idols. But in order to reject idols, you have to first of all identify them. You have to recognize them and realize their falseness, but also their power, because usually they stay hidden. So that's what the book is a bit about, of those issues.
Christopher Wright mostra que os ídolos estão em todos os lugares e todos os contextos, inclusive no contexto político. Eu tive uma conversa com Michael Frost e ele falou um pouco como a polarização atrapalha no contexto da missão de Deus e no contexto da Igreja. Se você quiser assistir um pouco a respeito desse vídeo, o link vai estar aqui na descrição. Sendo assim, perguntei a ele como os aspectos idólatras da política pode afetar no contexto da missão de Deus na história.
A slightly harder question, because first of all, to say, yes, I do think that the Bible makes it very clear that idolatry rests in political systems. The Old Testament is extremely clear on that God is interested in society and politics and rulers and kings and judges and the judicial system and the economic system and how the land is used. All of those are political issues, and God is concerned about those things. And that is where, when people start worshipping false gods of arrogance or of greed or of covetousness or whatever else it is, then politics, like everything else in human life, becomes very, very corrupt. Corrupt and violent. The two sins that are there that led to the flood in Genesis. That God sees that the whole of human life becomes corrupt and violent. Those two things go together because they are of the very essence of injustice and the perpetration of injustice. Now, when you ask what does that mean for Christian mission, I think it means that the Christian church must not be naive. That is, we must not assume that any political system is going to be good and pure and wonderful. Every political system will have a mixture of human goodness and being in the image of God. Even non-Christians can be men and women of goodwill who are trying to do good things and are seeking justice. But every political system is also in danger of being riddled with evil and arrogance and greed and sexual oppression and everything else. And so we need to be not naive. We need to relate to our societies with our eyes open. As Jesus said, we are to be, like lambs, but also as wise as serpents. We need to know what's there. But also I think there is a role for the church, or at least for Christians, to be prophetic in the sense of those who are prepared to stand up for the truth, to speak with integrity, to be men and women of honesty and truthfulness in cultures which increasingly, in the West at least, seem to have declared war on the truth. I mean, the extent now in which our politics are determined by lying, falsehood on an industrial scale. People who can just lie and lie and lie again and again and again and get away with it. And so part of our mission, I think, has to be to say, look, we speak on behalf of the God of truth, the God who demands integrity in public office. As David said, David the king said, I know, my God, that you look on the heart and you are pleased with integrity. So we as Christians in mission must be men and women of integrity and truth. But sometimes we may be called also to operate in a world of untruth and injustice, and to be doing what Micah said, to be seeking justice, love mercy, and walking humbly with our God.
Conseguimos entender que existem vários ídolos e eles estão em todos os lugares e afetam a nossa vida de alguma forma. Estão prontos a todo momento para nos dominarem e nos afastarem do Deus vivo. Mas como encontrá-lo? Como os líderes de uma comunidade podem perceber esses ídolos e como os membros podem notar esses ídolos na sua rotina, na sua vida? Como descobrir quais são os principais ídolos que dominam nossa sociedade? Será que existe alguma diretriz para isso? Essa foi a minha pergunta a ele.
identify gods, false gods, we can ask a number of questions. One is, what do people spend most of their money on? What do people spend most of their time on? What does our culture seem to value most highly or to be most impressed with? Why is it, for example, that whereas in medieval times, the tallest buildings in any town, village, or city were always the churches and the cathedrals, because they were there to glorify the God whom they were worshipping. Whereas in our cultures, the tallest buildings, the symbols of power, are our corporate buildings, the worship of Mammon, buildings of corporations or of banks, or in some cases of political power. There's a certain element still of the Tower of Babel in our cultures, that we want to build ourselves up to heaven. So look at those kind of things. What in any culture do people talk most about? What governs the media? What occupies people's thinking? What do people talk about as being most important? Is it the economy, or is it relationships, or is it sex, or is it getting a better job, or is it something to do with the values of human life and the love of God and the love of the neighbor, and putting others before ourselves and serving the needy and so on? So I think those are ways in which we can discern whether people's hearts have been gripped with idols. And above all, as I said earlier, the idol of the self, because there's a great deal, certainly in Western culture, and as Western culture penetrates so many other cultures, it's this idolatry of the autonomous, independent, self-choosing self. I must be fulfilled, and I will deny anything else that denies that. Whereas, of course, the calling of Jesus is deny oneself and love God first. So the idolatry of the self, which is very narcissistic, eventually leads, of course, to a kind of nothingness, because you end up feeling there's nothing in there, or else you have to keep on reinventing yourself. You become a self-made man or woman, and then you worship your creator. I've made myself what I want to be, and so I worship myself. And that's, I think, a very dangerous place to be.
Depois disso, nós precisamos perceber como podemos ser fiéis a Jesus em meio a toda essa questão. Como podemos nos manter fiéis a Jesus em um mundo idólatra? Ou melhor, como a igreja deve romper com os ídolos da sua cultura?
I think that it may sound very old-fashioned, but one of the ways the church needs to learn how to break with the idols of the culture is to read and study and preach the Bible long enough and hard enough and deep enough to understand that there is such a thing as idolatry, and the church can be very seduced and misled by that. But unless pastors and others in the church are actually seriously engaging with the scriptures from beginning to end, that is the whole story of the Bible, then it's not surprising if ordinary people who don't know their Bibles are led astray and are vulnerable to false teaching and prosperity gospel and all these other kind of things. In the Old Testament, the prophets come along, and of course they condemn the people for their idolatry and their sin, but their greatest accusation, the people they really blamed, were the priests. You find that in Hosea and in Malachi and elsewhere, because the priests were supposed to be the teachers. They were there to teach God's law to the people. We know that from Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Malachi and elsewhere. And so if the leaders of the church, the people whose responsibility it is to be preaching the Bible, are failing in doing that, are not preaching the scriptures at all, then it doesn't excuse the sin and idolatry of ordinary believers, but it goes a long way in that being the case, that ordinary Christians just don't know what the idols are. So that's the first thing I would say, is serious Bible teaching. The second thing I would say is that if any church or any Christian believer is going to in any way break with the idols of their culture, they better be prepared to suffer. Because the gods and idols, yeah, in one sense they're nothing, you know, they don't exist, they're not God, they're not gods. But because we invest so much in them, our culture pays its service to these gods. We expend vast expenditure on arms and weapons because we believe in the God of military power. You know, we put vast amounts of energy, investment in our gods. So we don't like them to be criticized. Okay? We don't like anybody getting out of line. And so that's why you find in a book like Daniel that if, you know, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, if they're not going to bow down and worship the state god, the idol of Nebuchadnezzar, and glorify his political power, then they're going to suffer. They're going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. Now, God rescued them, but God doesn't always rescue from death those who suffer at the hands of an idolatrous state. And so if a church is going to be prophetic, if they're going to bear witness against the principalities and powers, stand up for justice against the powers of injustice, then they will certainly suffer the consequences for that. And so we need to study the scriptures, and we need to be prepared for the consequences if we do begin to take a stand against the idols of our culture.
Essa foi a segunda parte da conversa. Se você ainda não viu a primeira parte, você pode se inscrever no canal para ter mais acesso ao nosso conteúdo e, ao mesmo tempo, o link vai estar aqui na descrição para você poder assistir a primeira parte.